So I'm going to be brutally honest. This video is made out of pure frustration because the other day I had to edit a project that I didn't shoot. Now, most of the time I don't mind doing that too much. Obviously I prefer to shoot and edit the same thing, but there are times where you do have to edit something someone else has shot. But the person who shot whatever it was I was editing made my life so much harder in post from a few mistakes they made that I want to cover in this video. So getting straight into it, the first point of exposure, and this will determine how well you can see your image. And if it's not right, it ruins the video. Looking at this, for example, we have the same shot over, under, and perfectly exposed. When your exposure isn't correct, it makes it harder to work out what's going on due to the lack of clarity. So do your best to try and get the exposure in camera as good as possible. You know, there are different tools you can use within your camera, and I do have a video up here explaining some of the ways you can perfectly expose your image. But yeah, if you don't want to trust your camera monitor, use an external monitor. If you don't trust that, use some external tools, like something that will get your exposure as good as possible, because without it, it does kind of ruin your image. Point number 2, and which was one of the most relevant things for the video that I recently edited, which is when you haven't shot in accordance for where your video is going to be delivered. 80% of my client work in the past year has all been portrait. So it's pretty safe to say that the portrait and 9:16 way of shooting is here to stay. And I'm not saying you necessarily have to turn your camera around to start shooting portrait all the time, because I, for one, am a big fan of still shooting wide, because you never know when you are going to need the wide version, but at least use guidelines or something so you know where the point is, where you're going to frame it is going to be. Because if you're looking at this shot here, this shot right now is perfectly framed for a 16:9. But if I merge that to 9:16, it's a little bit close and there's not really much detail. You want to be further back so you can see more of what's going on. If you're shooting at this in a wide format and you don't think about how you are going to crop in, everything's going to be slightly skewed, because when you do go to crop in, there's only a small part of the screen that you can see. So your close-ups are going to be super close up and almost unrecognizable of what's actually going on. So if possible, get some guidelines in your camera. If your camera doesn't have that, then you can use the rule of thirds, that kind of 3 grid thing. It's not exact, but that kind of middle section is roughly the 9:16 framing. So as long as you are trying to get your things in the middle of that, you can get that same sort of result of having an actual 9:16 guideline. And this framing of the shot brings me on to point 3, which is getting your basic shots. Wide, medium, close. That's it. Before you move on to getting all the fancy shots, all the cool movements, all of that, make sure you have a wide shot, a medium shot, a close up. For any basic edit, that is all you need. A wide shot to establish where we are, a medium shot to establish what we're doing, and a close-up shot for any further details. If you're ever overwhelmed or confused on what types of shots to get, just start with those 3. Once you have those 3 basic shots, then you can move on to getting the coverage, getting the cool shots, getting the cool movements, the tracking, all of that other stuff. Point 4 is where I do cut a little bit of slack because it's more complicated to learn these things, and that is your frame rates and your shutter speeds and when to use them in the right way. So for most things that you shoot, especially things like this, talking heads, general footage, general A-roll, should all be at around 24 or 25 frames per second. When you want some B-roll or things that you know you're going to be slowing down, that's when you'd go up to maybe 48, 50 or 60 frames per second. That way you have the option to slow it down by 2 or 2.5 times. And when you want to create super slow motion, that's when you'd go into the 120 frames per second and higher. That way you can obviously slow it down by 5 or more times. Now there's of course different stylistic ways you can use these frame rates, but as a base, those are the correct way to use most frame rates. But along with your frame rate comes shutter speed. And for a normal look, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 48, 50 frames per second. Now this rule of thumb is called the 180-degree rule. I won't bore you with the details of why it's called that. I'm sure if you are genuinely interested, you can look it up. But it's kind of to do with the old style way of selecting your shutter speed, which is actually your shutter angle. That's it. But the main reason why you want to keep on top of your shutter speed is because there's 3 things attached to it. Now these aren't necessarily problems, but they are consequences, but without the negative connotation applied to that. First one being your exposure. You can obviously control your exposure with the shutter speed. Shutter speed also impacts the motion blur, and lastly, it impacts the flicker that is in lights. Depending on where you are in the world, there's a certain shutter speed your video needs to be on, kind of in a round of like 50 or 60, to prevent you getting that flicker you see within your camera. But yeah, I think that all kind of makes sense without going into too much detail about everything. 5th and final point, talking to the client or talent. Well, just communication to everyone in general, because this can really make or break your relationship between the client, between the talent, between you working with those people ever again. It's just so key to have that general communication on set, because no one knows what's going through your head, no one knows what you're perceiving, no one knows the issues that you're thinking are. Just tell people that it's okay to have that conversation, especially with, in my case, is the talent. If I'm shooting with a talent and I know the shot that we're trying to get is going to take a long time, I'm going to tell them in advance, I'm really sorry, but this shot, it may take me a few takes, so you may have to do it over and over again. As long as you have that communication with that, they're not necessarily going to get frustrated the same way as if you keep saying, one more, nope, one more, nope, one more, and you just keep going. Like, they just want to get it over with and move on. So you just have that general communication. Same thing with the director. If you know a shot's going to be quite hard to take, let them know, see how they can help you, see if the client, if some of the expectations they've set aren't quite right. Just let them know, have that communication, because one, it's going to it's going to save you from a lot of problems in the future, and two, it just makes your life a whole lot easier. But I do go further into that point along with a few other points on this video right here, where I talk about how to make your videos more cinematic and an experience behind the scenes on set. But yeah, hope you have enjoyed this video. So if you have got a lesson, laugh, or a light bulb moment, I'd really appreciate you drop a like down below. And if you're feeling nice enough, and I have a feeling you are, you can hit that subscribe button. But with that being said, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.